Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Butterfly Effect podcast. Today is analysis for Little Hope. You know how this works. We go from the curator up to the next curator and we analyse everything that's in between. And mate, we're starting off with a pretty hilarious scene. Well, we think it's hilarious anyway. We're with Daniel and Taylor. They do a little bit of digging around first. And actually, before we do get to the chase, I do have a little bit of a point just on my end. So as Taylor, you find this hanging tyre, which is obviously a reference to the hanging tyre that you can see in the garden from the prologue of Little Hope. But I think it was at this point in the game that I was thinking, okay, so because she recognised it, I was like, right, so maybe it's like a time loop. Like this was my theory in my blind playthrough. So like there was a time loop, like somehow the characters were like stuck in this bubble and generations passed and they were just constantly like moving through time, but their souls were like trapped in this one area and they were like reliving sort of the same things over and over again, which to be fair I think is quite a neat idea. Obviously we will get to the twist and what that entails in the next part, but I don't know if you had any sort of theories at this point, mate, that you wanted to share.
Similar, to be honest. Like, obviously we know that the characters are linked. Like, let's say, like, you know, we're talking like Taylor in this chapter, so she's got Tanya in the prologue, and then there's Tabitha, so there's almost 3 timelines of the same person. And then sort of Taylor seeing this tire swing, it's like, okay, so is Taylor Tanya? And then you start to piece these things together, and I think the game are aware of that with this clue potentially, because I mean, to skip ahead to the curator at the end of this whole kind of chapter, this act even, like the curator will say, oh, perhaps you're starting to realise something. So I think the gears were turning at this point, but with Little Hope, like I said before, I was very much kind of like, oh, I'm just going to kind of see what the mystery does, I'm not going to guess too much.
Yeah, that's fair. And in this scene as well, we do get a little bit of a flashback, and I think it's just worth mentioning that because this, you know, it's probably fair to say that this series has been a little bit on the negative side for Little Hope. So, just wanted to throw a positive out there. But we do see a fine example of the branching again, like from the choice in the prologue. So, when you see the flashback scene where like Tabitha's getting hung, obviously in this playthrough, but alternatively that could have been being burned at the stake, which, you know, again, like it's just a nice nod. Obviously it comes back in House of Ashes as well. I just prefer perhaps the way it was executed in Little Hope, the fact that there's 2 different demons that you could potentially have got. So yeah, props to Supermassive there, but we've delayed it for far too long, mate. We've got to talk about this chase scene.
Yeah, because we always mention this in past videos. And now this is the analysis episode where we actually come to the moment where we're supposed to talk about it in detail, right? And I guess for me it's the pacing, and I watched your stream of this, or at least afterwards on YouTube, and one of your quotes was, how the hell did it end up there? It's so slow. Because, like, the way it's shot is really awkward, isn't it? Because, like, you've got, like, Taylor and Daniel that are, like, bombing it, you know, they are running, you're passing the QuickTime events. And then there's just these random use of slow-mo shots for each QTE where they're like in mid-air jumping, you know, while you have to hit the X button or whatever it is. And then you'll get like the, I guess, Taylor's demon. And the cool thing is, like you mentioned, you do get 2 different choices based off of how Anya dies in the prologue, right? So you can have the burning one and the floating one. I kind of prefer the floating one because, as I've mentioned previously, I just think it's cooler seeing like how creepy it is, seeing her feet not touch the ground. And I think it makes more sense with the slowness, her kind of like, you know, being really slow but just demonically approaching them in the air. However, in turn, you could almost argue that is worse though, because like the fact that Taylor and Daniel are bombing it, this monster's clearly going at 1 mile per hour, and then it'll switch shots, and then the monster's like right behind them, and it just doesn't make sense. And I just think, like, Little Hope struggles a lot with pacing in general, where there'll be, like, and especially in this part, as we will mention, there'll be, like, combat with, like, one of the monsters. Then they'll stop and have a bit of dialogue. Then they'll go back into combat. It's very stop-start, especially in this act. And, yeah, I think, like, you'd think, like, the sections would be stop-start, but this manages to do it in, like, a little game sequence, like, be so stop-start. And it's just, I'm not a big fan of it. I'm probably bashing it more than it needs to. But yeah, I've never been a fan of this chase. I almost found it hilarious when Supermassive Games clearly weren't going for that.
Yeah, so like maybe in the blind playthrough, even in the blind playthrough, it's sort of funny, but maybe then you could say there's potential jeopardy. I actually think though that it's not even possible for a character to die there. I might be wrong, but I'm pretty sure on that. So it actually makes more sense to fail all the QTEs and things in order for it to look a little bit more exciting than it would have been if you had passed all of them. But yeah, I don't know, it's certainly not going to go down as one of the best chase scenes. Like, that's probably going to rank bottom. Like, if we was to ever do a ranking of like chase scenes in like these games, you're thinking straight away maybe like the Emily chase in Until Dawn, the Emma chase, the Quarry. This one's rock bottom, mate. There's not really going to be anything else that's contending with it. You know what though, you did bring something up, and I was actually going to pitch it to you as like a little question, because I might be right. I don't remember them doing this in Man of Medan. I think it is the first time, the first example we see in Little Hope. It's the whole action bit. So like in that scene where you're with Daniel and Taylor, you're playing as one character, and then it sort of goes slow-mo and then pans to another character. And I don't think this was in Medan, but again, in the comments, correct me if I'm wrong. But when you're in the midst of an action scene, what do you think of that use, mate? Like, of shifting from one character to another, like, via slow-mo?
Funnily enough, like, I didn't really have any opinions on it, but one thing I will, take your point and give you perspective on is that, as I've discussed before, I originally played Little Hope in multiplayer mode. I used to have a housemate and we played this game, and this style doesn't work for multiplayer mode because you're having to pass the controller through these scenes, but you have to like hit the button to do the QuickTime event. So you're forced there. Like, for example, let's say I'm Daniel, you're Taylor, and I do my QuickTime event, and then it shifts to Taylor, and then I've got to like do the QuickTime events. Am I supposed to pause the game and hand you the controller so it kills the momentum of what we're watching on screen? I definitely think there should be an element of it being an interval where it's like, right, now it's this player's turn, hand the controller over. To have it in an action sequence where you pass it back and forth, it doesn't work. So I feel like that's something they maybe did drop the ball on, but maybe that's just me being an absolute boomer.
You know what? I never even considered it from a multiplayer front either, but it's actually a very good point. Because I think for me, it's I like the idea because it's going from one character to another, and they're just clearly indicating that you're playing as someone else now. But I also wonder if is it absolutely necessary? Like, if the camera just panned to a character and then there was a QTE, I'm so focused on the QTE that I'm not really caring about who I'm playing as in that moment. So I do feel like partly it is a little bit of a momentum killer. When you've got music in the background, hearts pumping, something's chasing you, and it just sort of does that slow-mo thing. Yeah, I understand it, but I've got to admit that it does take something away from me, in my experience anyway.
That's it. And one thing I do want to mention, mate, is that I will talk more about it in the last part 5 of our Little Hope analysis. But this flaw with multiplayer mode actually does lead to some deaths in my overall thing. So a bit of a spoiler for my sort of blind playthrough there. So it's actually flawed in a way where it can be fatal for some of the characters. So I, never got the perfect ending in my blind playthrough, which would have been nice. But hey, what can you do? They tried something, it didn't work. I at least appreciate them for trying something different, but this one just didn't land for me.
So yeah, we then move on. We're back with Andrew, Angela and John, I think. Yeah, it would be, at least in my playthrough. But actually, soon enough, all of the characters do reunite outside the church. Now, a scene now plays out where we then see Vince approaching the church, and we have a choice whether it's to flee or help. Now, this obviously was the curator version. We do also know that had you had the gun in that situation, which I didn't in this playthrough, there is also an opportunity to fire that gun. Not necessarily at Vince, but you can see the demon behind him. The consequences being that if you do fire the gun, we know that that does lead to the arrest. Now, I was actually very intrigued at this because I failed the heartbeat earlier, so I didn't have the gun. So I was like, I want to see what they do with this choice. It did come up. It said flee versus help. Now, I chose to flee, and as the people that saw the stream later on will know that it did actually end up, spoiler alert, thingy getting arrested at the end. And I was sort of thinking, why is that a bad thing? Like, why would Vince call the police on Anthony or Andrew at this particular moment for fleeing from him? It's just a bit of an odd thing. Like, when he runs into you later on, he's like, hey, they're coming, obviously referring to the police. I'm like, really? Like, you base that? If you went to help him, and I assume, then he wouldn't have called the police. And I just found it a slight flaw. Potentially, maybe someone could clear it up, but yeah, it just struck as a little bit odd to me, mate.
Yeah, I wonder if you had a glitch, because I watched your playthrough, with the analysis, so I've not seen how yours ends, and I'm surprised. I saw you flee earlier. So, like, if we break it down, what have you actually done to Vince to warrant him calling the police on you? He saw you in a bush at one point. Is that why you've been arrested? Because you were hanging around in a bush? Like, is that the reason you got arrested? Because I'll tell you my version. Obviously, as I mentioned, and this, I didn't have the controller at this time, but the person I was with did try and help, and they actually shot at the the monster. So then Vince freaked out, and then I was like, okay, clearly only we can see this monster. So it was handy to have that info, but in turn it did mean that, spoiler alert, there are kind of 3 main endings to Little Hope, and it meant we were locked in for getting not the good one, either the mid one or the bad one. So Andrew does get arrested for mine, because in our playthrough we did shoot.
Yeah, that's another thing as well. I remember this from my blind playthrough, that it was so apparent that it was at that point in the character's head that it did hit a little bit of a bum note for me, and it did sort of take the jeopardy out of the monsters, because I'm like, why can't Vince see that creature behind him? Oh, okay, it's clearly imaginary again, which, is a topic for another discussion, so I won't go into it now, but it preludes the ending to this game. It preludes the discussion of, they've done the same as Medan sort of thing. So, I've got to admit, I do wish that was perhaps handled a little differently. But yeah, moving on from here, so we're inside the church. They're back together again, have a bit of a chat. A nice little reference to House of Ashes here as well. I think Taylor mentions vampires, so again, as a little Easter egg for the next game. And admittedly, not a lot happens. We then have a scene when they're back outside the church, and we're playing as Daniel. And I've got to admit, mate, this is where things started to get a little tense, because, as you all know, my objective in this was to try and keep Daniel alive in this playthrough, just to spite Liam. So when the choice come up, I was like, right, this is going to be a combat moment, and I knew that obviously you had to confront the demon. And this is where the next point comes in. So we've already mentioned that I've struggled with the spamming one, the QTE spamming one on lethal difficulty. Also, the heartbeats have randomly become difficult as well. But mate, this one, the one where you've got to move the cursor to a specific area on the creature, which it doesn't really point out for you. Like, the cursor can flash red, but the time, it's the time that's against you. In this particular fight, I managed to get through it, but my god, it put sort of the nerves in me, because it was one of those situations where the creature then hit Daniel, and I was like, oh god, is that it, So weirdly, it's one of those ones that I never thought would be difficult at all. As soon as I go into lethal difficulty though, it took me by surprise how just moving the cursor QTE, how difficult it was.
I love that though, because the way I discovered it is because I couldn't make that particular stream, so I never watched this one live. But you uploaded it to YouTube afterwards, and the title was Mission Failed. So already I was hands in the air at that point, yes, he's dead. And when I watched it, I never actually saw that Daniel death before, so Oh my god, it was glorious. One thing I kind of disagree with, and this might surprise some of the fans out there because I'm going to defend Daniel a little bit here. We never thought the day would come, but I'm going to do it on the moment of his death, I just found it weird that you unlocked the personality trait arrogant, from doing this. You kind of see it in his eyeball, it unlocks, and I'm like, how is that arrogant? Like, Taylor tripped up. He went back to save her, and he died a hero's death. I'm like, that's the opposite to arrogant, surely.
Oh, yeah.
So yeah, I just was like, that is a bit weird. But with this whole section, I quite like the church location. It's a bit like we mentioned, it's a shame we didn't go into school earlier. Or I shouldn't say that phrase really, but obviously, it's a shame we didn't go into school earlier. We have this church, and I'm like, oh, cool. If you subscribe to any potential spirit theory, it might be that this is a safe place. So I quite like that whole section. But yeah, one thing I wanted to comment on is when Daniel and Taylor are initially running away, Taylor can trip over this stick on the ground, but you succeeded your QTE, and then a second later she trips up anyway, and that felt a little cheap to me. That that happens anyway just to get the character in the place they need to be. You mentioned earlier how there was a QTE where it probably makes sense to fail them to make the scene work. And I almost wonder if Little Hope, you're supposed to be failing certain QTEs to actually make the scenes gel. But yeah, I mean, going back to Daniel's death though, mate, I'm strongly confident because you're pretty good at the games and the QTEs and stuff. That probably wouldn't happen if you're not doing it on lethal difficulty, in my opinion, mate.
Yeah, no, in my blind playthrough it didn't, and actually there's someone who I think it was Jonathan Jimbo who's telling from watching the stream told me that actually if I was to get Daniel to the point where you push that crate underground and then he has another fight with his demon, they are ruthless with the QTEs. Whether it's the getting the just hitting the button in time, the moving the cursor, the spamming, Daniel on lethal difficulty is very hard to keep alive. So it looked like the odds were stacked against me anyway, but nonetheless I did try and I did fail. But funnily enough, actually, because we've skipped forward a touch, just a little point on my end, sort of comes out of nowhere. Maybe it was because that she was just alive and everyone felt happy. But prior to that sort of combat scene with Daniel, they do take a break from running away from the demons, and you do have an opportunity. Obviously I didn't because I didn't have the gun. When Angela emerges as a weird shadow sort of thing to potentially shoot her or not. In my playthrough, she comes back and suddenly everyone's really complimentary to her, even Taylor and Daniel, who've been sick of her for this entire game. But because she's alive, everything's all hunky-dory again. But I wanted you to tell me, mate, what happened in your playthrough? Did you have the gun and did you shoot at Angela? Or did your flatmate shoot at Angela? Yeah,
the last one, yeah. So, but that's the thing, right? And it is the point. So yeah, my housemate we had the gun, and my housemate shot the shadow. So they've shot Vince, they've shot the shadow, killed Angela. So for you, Daniel's dead here. For me, it's Angela. She's my first to die. But so I'm down to full characters at this point. But it's one of those ones though where I personally myself wouldn't have shot, because we know with supermassive games, if there's it's with the quarry, Ryan, shooting Jacob in the bushes. If you don't know the threat, you don't shoot. You just don't take that gamble. And I feel Man and Medan, Until Dawn, they have the tutorials at the start to kind of allude to that. Little Hope doesn't really do that at any point. So this was this person's first experience playing a supermassive game, and they were thrown into Little Hope, and they just sort of saw a shadow on screen, shoot it, and they went and did it. So there was never really an indication it wasn't it was an option not to shoot. So it kind of poses this other question: is Little Hope kind of not a new supermassive game user friendly, if that makes sense?
I mean, yeah, it's certainly worth asking the question, because yeah, there's obviously nods to previous games and such. It's also I'm trying to think of what my logic was, is if something is purposely obscure, which that's what it was in that instance, then I obviously wouldn't shoot. Be interesting one day if one in these games though, where they pull that trick, but it is actually genuinely a threat, and then because you didn't shoot, it's like, oh well, you know, you sort of screwed up. You had the chance to shoot, but you didn't. I suppose the closest thing you could say is like Abby and Nick from The Quarry, when he's just stood there in human form, and you're like, well, I'm not going to shoot him because he's a human at the minute, and then you get punished for obviously not shooting because he turns into a werewolf and rips your head off. But yeah, potentially onto something there, mate. Maybe like newbies would potentially have shot Angela there.
No, that's the thing, mate. So, you know, it's one of those ones where I don't hold a grudge too much. But yeah, it's like, you know, I lost Angela. A lot of gunshots were going off in Little Hope in my playthrough. Bang, bang, bang. But one thing I wanted to kind of talk about as well, and it's something we've scraped the surface with a little bit, but it's like the flashback scenes. You mentioned in the last part that like the flashbacks start to lose their sting a little bit, because we have previously mentioned that for me the flaw of Little Hope is the fact that the main five are meh, as touted by the last video. So they go from place to place, but like, I don't know, like the nuggets of info and the plot advances with all the flashback characters, right? But like these flashback characters, I really enjoyed their scenes because I felt like the acting, you know, was just a bit more there. You know, it was a bit more powerful. You get a lot of them out those scenes, especially because they're really tragic. You know, the executions. But I kind of really felt that in this act, mate. It felt very like walk, get your arm grabbed, you know, and that's just very much something that keeps happening. And like these ghosts are very handsy, aren't they? Like you're just constantly getting grabbed and pulled into a flashback. But yeah, it's just it just felt very quick. Like boom, we had Taylor getting written off with like the hanging or the burn. I mean, it is cool that like depending on the death you choose again, she gets a different execution. I really like that touch. But then just moments later, you're having Daniel thrown out the building, and it is cool that you do piece together it is related to the prologue death. But like you say, very stop-start, very repetitive, and it's just kind of like I rolled my eyes, and it's like you know what's coming. Like the Little Hope twist is like sort of good in terms of the way like you're not really going to predict it. You're borderline genius if you did, but in terms of like the actual plot now of what's coming, it just became quite repetitive and predictable.
Yeah, and it's sort of, you know, another reason why I feel like it's a missed opportunity. I mean, we've lauded sort of like the prologue characters and the flashback characters, and it just sort of makes me want to have like a period set sort of like DPA game. Like I know we're going to get a Directive 8020 where it's sci-fi and it's future, but it sort of makes me think that they do have this tendency of having everything set in the past at the beginning, having... I know obviously House of Ashes is technically 2003, so don't jump down my throat if you're in the comments. But you get what I mean. It's sort of very present day, you know, when you're dealing with the characters and everything's in the past for the prologue. So, but it'll be quite refreshing if, like, you know, maybe that was flipped, or maybe we just had something that's set in the past. Like we talked about season 2 of like intercession and stuff, and perhaps that being like quite medieval. Like I'm interested to see what that looks like. You know, I hope it's not everything necessarily set in the present day, you know.
No, I completely agree on that one. But nonetheless though, mate, I have critiqued the game quite a lot, but I'm in a happy mood today because Daniel died, so you know, there's always that.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, I've not got any other points to add for this episode, mate. Have you got anything to add before we wrap up?
Yeah, I guess one more thing I can do, because this is quite a short analysis, because like, you know, Little Hope has kind of like almost like an extra act and one, you know, a few more curated scenes kind of thing. One thing I just kind of wanted to mention, mate, is that in the midst of like kind of the combat and the chases, there is that one moment where as Taylor, you have to choose whether to go left or right. Now, we know that if you go right, you reunite with Andrew. That's what you did in your stream. It is the correct call. But if you go left, you bump into one of the monsters and you have to succeed some QTEs, or Taylor could potentially die. I just wanted your opinion. Do you think it is good having a fatal random choice in there, or potentially fatal? Because if you pick the wrong one, you still have QTEs to kind of gamble and get out of it with. But do you think that's kind of harsh that people there might pick left with a 50-50 coin toss?
For me, the reason it's odd is just like the blandness of the choice in terms of picking left or right. You know, when you're sort of thrown into a situation of like run versus hide, or Whoa, blimey, I'm trying to think of certain choices like throughout DPA, but it might involve an item or something like that. This is
Yeah.
literally go left or go right. It is quite literally what you say. It's the flip of a coin. I think it would have been unfair had, you know, you go left and then the character gets killed. That's just flat out unfair. I think the fact that there's QTEs though does soften that blow. I don't know why I'm so like predisposed to right, but I always, whenever there's a choice like that, I almost say like choose the right answer, and then that sort of makes me go right. I don't know if it's just a weird logic, but yeah. So like I didn't even have that in my blind playthrough either. But to answer your point, I think it's okay. I think it's just maybe it would have been better. Like they actually did an example where I think it was pretty clever. This might be the next part. It's like follow the footprints or follow the noise. See, do you know what I mean? Like there's a little bit of more working out to do, whereas there's left and right, and it's like, oh, well, okay, it's whatever way, you know, it is what it is. There's nothing for me to deduce here.
No, I get you, and it kind of reminds me as well of like Until Dawn, the prologue, where you're Beth and you have to find Hannah, and there's two different paths, and yeah, one's footprints, one's noise, I'm pretty sure. So it is kind of like there is a kind of method, and you know, you could potentially work it out, but in this case, you know, it is almost like a 50-50 coin toss, and I do agree with you. I'm glad they have QTEs to cushion the blow and make it non-fatal, because you could argue the devil in me do that the way you killed Erinoth in the barn. You know, it is like go up or go to the door, and if you pick the wrong one, even because in my opinion there's not really much to determine that, you've got to make a split decision with like no real logic thrown in there. So yeah, like I don't mind the random choices, but give us some QTEs to bail us out. Bit like Matt with the Elk in Until Dawn. Don't just give us a, oh, you go left, you get bruised. But yeah, nonetheless, I just wanted your opinion on that. So yeah, it'd be interesting as well to know what you know, the guys in the comments think as well.
Yeah, I'm still bitter about that Erin choice and the devil in me, like because that's literally what we were saying there. If I run to choke, if I run for the door, then A, if someone was on their own, they'd get the door open anyway, so it makes no sense that Erin can't get that door open. But B, it's like, well, maybe by running, I should then have to perform QTEs to get away from Dumet. But that's, you know what I mean, we've covered that topic already. But yeah, like, I'm basically, in short, I'm still bitter about it. But yeah, I mean, after that, back to Little Hope, we have a curator scene. He's doing his thing, he's talking to us. There's a quote he says, perhaps you've started to realise something. In my blind playthrough, I was thinking, mate, I got a bloody clue. I think, like I say, I was at this time loop theory, if I remember rightly. I got the whole doppelganger relationship thing. Can't recall if I was even relaying that back to the prologue. I might have done. But yeah, that's all of my thoughts for this part, mate. So if you've got anything else, and then we'll wrap up.
Nah, not at all. Just join us guys in the next week for the last part of the Little Hope analysis and find out who survived in our blind playthroughs.
Absolutely. So thanks for listening, guys. Keep an eye out for all DPA and Little Hope related content, and we will see you in the next video.
See you guys soon.